Yo, what's up, guys? Here's a little practice session. Sometimes when I get up in the morning and I'm in between sleep and waking, I just start practicing. Like my brain just starts, I don't know, it just wants to go through it. Alright, so when we're talking about our physiology, these two parts, so what I'm trying to do, I want to just build out this map. So, okay, we're talking about these two parts, we're talking about mind body, right? This is just one of those classic distinctions that has pervaded like poetry and literature and also religion. It's sort of like the, I don't know if it's, that's not really ego, but just so many stories have been written about our inability to coordinate these two parts of ourselves, the mind and the body, because the body wants one thing and the mind knows better. For example, so it's a very storied division, and much has been written about how we're supposed to coordinate these, how we're supposed to put these two things together to do the right thing, to do the thing that's going to allow us to move forward. And so crimes of passion are like this inability to properly coordinate your mind and body. That's in some sense just kind of like letting, you could say it's kind of like letting the body lead, where it's just you're purely following your raw primal senses, and so that's a result of the body. Um, so when we talk about these distinctions, then we sort of already know that the coordination, the successful coordination between these two items is largely what determines our success in life. Um, so so let's get technical about it. Let's really get down into the weeds about how these two things come together, and then we'll sort of talk about what it means and how it relates to story. I mean, you could say the story is how these two things come together. But before we go there, let's kind of build up how these two things actually work together. So you have your mind, and specifically, we're talking about the conscious mind. Like that's the part that you can control, and that's when we refer to when we talk about the mind, our conscious ability to think and think through things, and a lot of that's located actually in a pretty specific part of the brain. That's going to be in your frontal lobes. It's the front part, I guess, the lobe, and it's an area called the prefrontal cortex, which actually sits on top of the motor cortex, which is a little bit interesting because, like much of what your consciousness does is about directing your movements. Like the motor cortex is what allows you to move. I think it's what allows me to control things. I don't know exactly how I'm controlling it. I just know that I can control it, and that happens to the motor cortex. But the reason why you move um, is what's the word? The reason why you move is derived, is constructed, is formed. The reason why you move is derived, is generated, is originates from. Yeah, well, anyways, the reason why you move is generally constructed in the prefrontal cortex. That's what makes that determination. And even inside the prefrontal cortex, there are certain centers that are specifically um, dedicated to making decisions. Essentially, it's dedicated to what? I guess there's it's there are certain centers within the prefrontal cortex that's specifically dedicated to, I guess it's decision making, right? It's dedicated to how you decide what to do. Like it's dedicated to how you formulate and decide upon actions, how you move through the world, right? Um, right. Some parts are just dedicated to sequencing and logic, and solving problems. I guess it's all a bit. I'm not sure exactly how the connection goes, to be honest. I mean, that's part of why it's hard to. I just don't know the full, and maybe no one quite knows, but we do know that there's a specific part of the prefrontal cortex that's dedicated to how you coordinate your actions in the world. Like, and this part is called the dorsolateral, the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So when we're talking about the mind, in some sense, we're talking about a very, very, a very small part, a tiny, tiny part, physical area of your physiology. It's really interesting, and it's kind of like this rudder on a ship. Because this dorsolateral, they call it the planning center, and you got to be really careful. Like the planning center, it's like that's a very, very technical term that they're trying to say, like a plan. Anything that you do that's deliberate in the world is a plan. Even getting up and getting a drink of water is a plan. And like you don't really think about it, but there's all these things that you take for granted. How did you make that plan to get a drink of water? Well, you had to determine, first of all, that you were thirsty. Like, you had to take this. There's nothing that's telling you, like, I'm thirsty. It's just this sensation that you have. This need for satiation in a very specific way, and you've learned over the years that means you're thirsty. And then you had to determine that you were thirsty for water. So that means you had to know what water is. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of monotonous to go through, but like it's like it took you years to figure out that it made sense to go and get water. Like it just, you know what I mean? So anyways, like the dorsolateral is responsible for making plans, and that's anything that you do that's deliberate in the world, generally speaking, and that's what steers your entire ship. And you think about that. So it's a coordinating device. Now, it's also a signal interpreter, because in order to make plans, you have to have a lot of information to make a plan, at least to make a good plan. And the dorsolateral is kind of like this cockpit, this pilot in a cockpit, where just like a pilot has this very complex instrument panel, it's got all these readouts and dials and measures and meters and gauges, talking about the state of the plane, the engines, all that stuff, and then talking about the state of the world, like the wind speed and barometric pressure and the incoming weather systems and blah, 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 right? The dorsolateral is the same way. It's got these very specific readouts on the state of your physiology, specifically your autonomic system, and also your limbic and instinctual systems. Your autonomic system is what runs your body. It's your nervous system. And it generally pertains to the overall state of your physiology, whether you're tired or energetic or nervous, or like it's kind of like but it's more, I guess it's more physically translated, I suppose, like, because your dorsolateral, in terms of what you're aware of, I mean, there's a ton of stuff that you're not aware of that your autonomic does. It's all your automatic processing that you don't really consciously know how to do. Like, you don't know how to work your bladder. Like, you don't know how to produce uric acid or whatever. You don't know how your liver works, or your blood pressure, or even how your heart beats, or again how you're moving. You don't really know how that works. It just does work. Your autonomic nervous system. But what you're consciously aware of, though, is like the overall state, and that's mostly translated through three major areas. It's your heart, your lungs, and your stomach. You have a pretty good conscious awareness of the states of those three centers, and that kind of paints a pretty good picture of your overall, what they call, arousal state. Like, are you ready to go? Or you just want to stay put? Do you want to run away, right? Flight or flight? That's kind of a way to think about it. So the dorsolateral has information on that. It receives signals from all sorts of places. So, your heart, your lungs, and your stomach. And it's also connected to your, like, it sends signals back and forth. So there's this relationship that your dorsolateral has with your autonomic. And then also, of course, your emotional and instinctual centers. Like, these are all the things that you're consciously aware of. And that that creates this portrait of your physiology, as well as your motivations and your desires, right? Like, this is all just through signaling. and you've had to develop over the years like a map of your signals, like a key, like a translation of your signals. Like, oh, this impulse or sensation means I want food, and not only that, but that signal is pretty sophisticated. But just sort of getting back to the dorsolateral, I mean, it's right. So it's this pilot in a cockpit. It receives all these signals from your physiology and like your current state, and then also, of course, on what you're perceiving on the outside world, your so-called exteroceptive senses, like what's outside of you. And this is like your five senses, right? And it's taking all these signals and putting it together and constructing like an environment. And the way that it does that is it generates rules. So it's called a flexible rule setting device. This is probably the most technical term. This is the smallest, most, I don't know if minute is the word, but it's the most basic unit of what it does to say that it sets rules. So you could think of the dorsolateral like this computer programmer where it's building out a game, maybe like a game programmer, and it's trying to build out this environment with which the characters can play in. And when a computer programmer builds an environment, what does it have to do? It has to code in essentially rules. Like, this is blue and that's green, and if you jump with this much force, this is how high you'll jump, and like it's a world. It's the world is constructed of very, very complex sets of rules that interact with each other, and so like when you're getting these signals from your eyes, like light signals, your DLPFC is computing like, okay, this is how light works, and this is how it looks, and this is what it means, and right, it's just generating all these different rules. Like, this is blue and that's green, and green means this, and yellow. It's like it's putting it together, and it's taking all the senses. And is that the best way? Yeah, it's taking all your senses. It's taking all these different signals and arranging them into some kind of coherent structure. Like, we perceive the world as this rich, mesh, like this. I almost see like this contoured connection of rules, this contoured landscape made up of all these rules, right? It generates this landscape, the rules of physics, thermodynamics, whatever, even social rules, like how you're supposed to behave in certain contexts. So these are all rule domains, or these are all matrices of rules. Like these rules come together and form kind of networks. They're all networks of rules. Yeah, they form networks. Okay, yeah. So then right, yeah. The DLPFC, it takes all these signals from the outside world, from your five senses, and I'm like this because my shoulder fucking hurts like a motherfucker. But yeah, it's taking, what is it doing? It's taking all these sets of rules and constructing them into vast networks that form contours and shapes, kind of like. Yeah, I think that's how you could think of it. That's how I'm envisioning it. I almost see like this graph, this empty space with all these graphs and lines and everything. It's almost like the Matrix, right? Like it's all code. It's all these coded. Everything exists by its limits, I suppose. Everything is kind of built out of a system of rules, like a bunch of aspects. Right, so the dorsolateral, it takes these signals and interprets them as kind of like these little rules. So they call it a flexible rule setting device. And that's a really technical and interesting way of thinking about it, because it's almost like this computer programmer, right? It's like a game programmer where it's building out a world. It has to code out the world. And so the world is made of all these different rules. Like, what are the rules of this world? How does it work? Like, if I exert force here, what's the resultant reaction there? Or even what something looks like is kind of like they're aspect rules. This is how something is. That's a rule. This is black, or that's green, or that appears as yellow. That's very bright. That's dark, right? The rules of light. Then there's the rules of heat, thermodynamics, and the rules of physics, of action and reaction, and mass times acceleration equals force, and right, there's all these different rules that govern the world, and we perceive them kind of, I guess, intuitively. Like, we're not doing these equations. We just kind of, it's really weird how we perceive things. But the dorsolateral is taking these just sensory signals and then constructing some kind of rule out of it. Like, it's trying to make a pattern out of it, and with this pattern, we can turn the world into a predictive environment where we generate an expectation of how the world behaves, and that's organized into a network, a cohesive network of rules with which we can now navigate through successfully. We're just constantly obeying and are aware of and taking into account multiple matrices of rules at all times. That's what we're doing. And that's what the dorsolateral is doing. You could think it's a contextualizing device. So like how we conceive of the world, like how we construct the world, it's constructed of rules, how it works. If I do this, then this happens. If I want to move through the world in a certain way, then I have to, let's say I want to move through the world, I want the result of my movement to be, right, I have a desire of how I want to move through the world. So let's say I want to move the world in a certain way, then I have to obey rules. If I want to arrive at that location, at that point, and there's a mountain in the way, then I have to go around the mountain or over the mountain, where I have to take into account that rule, the rule of the mountain, the rule of the solid object that I can't move through. So you want to have a sense of what are the rules of this environment, what are the rules of the game, in order to make plans about how to move through the game. You need to have this information about how the world is put together if you're going to try to move through the world and accomplish things in the world. And not only that, but you also have to have a sense of what you want to accomplish, which is also a set of rules that you have to construct out of a number of non-linguistic sensory signals that are coming from within, right? That's what this dorsolateral has to do. So it's this mind-blowingly complex device that's able to take into account a multitude, like millions upon millions of rules probably, and sensations, and then somehow arrange that into two cohesive networks that it now has to coordinate, right? It's you and the world, and it's trying to coordinate these two systems together such that because you want to accomplish things in the world, you need to move through the world. It's sort of like, it's basically a game, you know? It's like this really rich computer program. And so, yeah, that's the DLPFC. It's this highly sophisticated coordinating device. And then when we're talking about the body, what we're talking about, again, this autonomic nervous system, right? All these unconscious processes, the organs, the hardware that is constantly generating signals and working in the background. So that's, right, the body. And then that also includes your emotions and your instincts. So when we're talking about the body, we're talking about all the unconscious signaling, all the stuff that's not really derived, that just sort of appears before you, right? Just signals that come. It's your internal signals and also it's signals coming in from your exteroceptive senses, your external senses, and then also your internal senses, right? So when we're talking about the body, we're talking about, what we're really talking about are your unconscious signaling. When we're talking about the body, we're really talking about the unconscious signaling. We're talking about the body, right? We're talking about your autonomic nervous system, which is all these processes happening generally in the background, though, as we said, your You're aware of certain parts of your physiology, the heart, the lungs, and the stomach. Those are the three main centers. But you're sort of aware of your overall arousal state. You're aware of your body's ability to take action. Your body's readiness to take action. So when we talk about the body, what are we talking about exactly? We have the signal. What we're talking about is the signal generator. Oh God. Oh. Okay. Just walked across the keyboard. So when we're talking about the body, what we're talking about is, what are we talking about exactly? I guess when we're talking about the body, when we're talking about the body, we're generally talking about your readiness or non-readiness for action. That's essentially you're talking about. When we're talking about the body, you're kind of talking about like your overall. You're talking about the state of your physiology, your readiness for action, for example, and that's generally governed by your heart, your lungs, and your stomach. Those are three main areas that give you a lot of information on your readiness for action, or your readiness for rest, or your readiness to run away. Right? These basic these basic what are these basic actions, right? These basic survival instincts. When we're talking about the body, what are we talking about there? Yeah, it's what we're talking about is your right, your overall physiological, the state of your physiology. When we're talking about the body, we're talking about kind of your capacity for action. More or less. I mean, we're talking about your capacity for action, which is generally governed, at least what you're conscious in terms of what you're consciously aware of is the state of your heart, your lungs, and your stomach. Those are three pretty big pieces of your readiness for action or for rest or for running away, right? These three basic modes of action, these three basic modes of operation, fight or flight. That's your autonomic system, and then it also refers to your emotional states, your instinctual states, which is kind of an expression of your desire, what you want to achieve, what you need, what you want. So your emotional states. And then it also pertains to your exteroceptive senses, which is like how you perceive the world. The sensory data, incoming sensory data that's coming from the world, the environment around you. So the body is kind of like this massive signal generator. It generates signals about your internal state, your readiness for action, also about your desires, your needs and desires, your emotions, and then about the state of the world. What's happening out there? How does it work? How is it put together? What are the rules? What are the rules in this world? So that's the body. And then the way it all comes together, all these signals comes together, is through this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So you have the signal generator, very, very sophisticated, very sensitive, generating tons of information, able to tease out minutia upon minutia of detail if we're really paying attention to it. And then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that takes all these signals and constructs them into interpretive rule sets with which we can use to generate plans to accomplish our desires, which is also a complex rule set. So it's this giant coordination. It just sounds like it's dizzying to talk about, but it also feels almost kind of stupid to talk about because we do it so automatically. It's just like, oh yeah, man, of course I want to go to the club on Saturday. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's my plan. So So we really want to talk about like how these two things coordinate because that's the key thing that allows us to move through the world. That's how we survive. That's everything. It's everything. Well, yeah, it's pretty good.